Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Highland Mystery. Oliver here. Tommel Castle is the sort of Highland hotel that likes to think a silver teapot can settle anything. Outside, the snow comes slanting over the hills. Inside, the carpets are thick, the smiles are polished, and everyone is trying very hard not to look worried. That would be harmless enough, were it not for the arrival of a woman who believes standards are more important than kindness, and appearances dearer than comfort. Tonight's tale begins with high tea, old money, nervous staff, and the sort of quiet humiliation that leaves a mark long before anyone speaks the word murder. There are grand rooms, thin tempers, and one small flaw hidden in a piece of red wax that will matter more than anyone yet knows. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you like what I'm doing here. Tell us where you are and what time it is in the comments. Now, turn off the lights and let's get started tonight. Chapter 1. High tea and higher standards. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the snow had begun in earnest. It came down over the hills beyond Lochs in a dry, determined sweep and crossed the road to Tommel Castle in white slanting lines. The hotel stood above the loch with all the confidence of old stone and inherited furniture. Its windows glowed, its chimneys smoked. From a distance it looked secure enough to survive wars, marriages, and bad management. Up close, Hamish Macbeth thought it had the strained air of a woman smiling through a headache. He had not intended to spend his afternoon among silver cake stands. He had been at the police station, where the stove gave out more hope than heat. When Nessie Curry had burst in without knocking, Jessie at her shoulder like an echo in a camel-hair coat. "It's no right," said Nessie, glaring over her glasses as if Hamish himself had arranged it. "No right?" echoed Jessie. Hamish looked up from the report he had been pretending to read. Lugs, sprawled near the fire like an old hearthrug, opened one blue eye and then closed it again. He had judged the Curry sisters before and found them inexhaustible. "What's no right?" asked Hamish. "That hotel woman," said Nessie. "The one from London, marching folk about as if they were recruits." "Recruits," said Jessie. She told young Morag MacLean her wrists were common. "Common wrists," said Jessie, scandalised on Morag's behalf. Hamish blinked. "That would be a rare insult." "It was no the words only," said Nessie. "It was the way of it, in front of paying guests. Mrs. Wellington heard it from a lady who heard it from the chef's cousin, and the Patels have had 3 people in already saying the place has gone queer." "Queer," said Jessie. Hamish laid down his pen. In Lochs, information travelled with remarkable efficiency once wrapped in moral outrage. He had learned long ago that the village gossip network often reached a conclusion before the police had reached the gate. "And what would you have me do?" he asked mildly. "Have a word." "A quiet word," added Jessie. Hamish rose, stretching his long legs. "Aye, then, I'll go up and drink their tea and see if the kingdom can be saved." Nessie sniffed. "You joke, Hamish Macbeth, but rich people are often the worst when they begin improving things." "The worst," said Jessie. Lugs stood at once, for he associated any movement by Hamish with the possibility of food, interest, or both. He shook himself mightily, showering the floor with a little dust and a great sense of purpose. "You're no coming," Hamish told him. Lugs wagged as if he had won an argument. In the end, the dog came. The road up to Tommel Castle was slick with the beginning of ice. The loch below was black as slate, and the snow made the line between water and sky look uncertain. Hamish drove slowly, one hand easy on the wheel, his mind less on the hotel than on the people in it. Hotels of that sort were theatres of a kind. Everyone had a part. Some were born to it, some were paying dearly to play it, and some were working in the wings while being told not to breathe too loudly. Tommel Castle's lounge was full when he arrived. A fire burned in the grate. Tiered trays of sandwiches and little cakes stood on low tables. There was polished silver everywhere, and the sort of heavy carpet that made a man feel apologetic for his boots. A pianist in the corner was doing his best to make the weather sound decorative. Lugs took one look at the room, chose the thickest stretch of carpet in front of the fire, and lay down with the solemnity of a visiting chief. A footman approached, thought better of it, and retreated. Hamish removed his cap and stood a moment. taking things in with the lazy expression that led strangers to underestimate him. Mr. Halberton Smythe was near the mantelpiece, handsome in a faded way, and already tired. Mrs. Halberton Smythe had the brittle brightness of a woman who believed in standards because she feared accounts. Between them, moving from table to table with a notebook in one hand and a look of permanent disappointment on her face, was Marjorie Vane. She was not beautiful, though she had plainly worked at being impressive. Her dark suit was cut to suggest authority. Her hair was too exact to be accidental. Her smile was the sort used by people who think warmth is a tactical error. She bent over a tea table where a young waitress was placing plates. "No, no, no," Marjorie said in a carrying voice. "Not from the left when the guest is already turned. You force them to adapt to you. That is service failure." The waitress, a girl scarcely out of school, flushed scarlet. "I'm sorry, miss." "And do stop clutching the plate. Your wrists are quite wrong. Relax them. At present, you look common." The nearby guests glanced up with that furtive alertness people affect when they are delighted to see someone else being humiliated. Mr. Halberton Smythe made a hopeless half-step forward. His wife laid 2 fingers on his sleeve and kept smiling. Hamish crossed the room. "Afternoon," he said. Mrs. Halberton Smythe turned as if she had just remembered religion. "Constable Macbeth, how good of you to come." "Villagers were troubled," said Hamish. "I thought I'd see if there was anything needing done." Marjorie Vane looked him up and down. Her gaze lingered a second too long on his height, his red hair, and the fact that his dog was asleep on the carpet among the quality. She had the air of a woman making swift notes under her skin. "And you are?" she asked. "Hamish Macbeth, locked of police." "How reassuring," she said, in a tone that meant the opposite. Hamish smiled pleasantly. "I try." Mrs. Halberton Smythe gave a little laugh that died at once. "Miss Vane has been sent to review our standards." "Indeed," said Hamish. Marjorie shut her notebook with a dry snap. "To save the hotel. If we are to be honest, one cannot trade forever on faded tartan and local sentiment. Guests pay for excellence. Excellence requires obedience." Hamish glanced toward the waitress, who had retreated behind a tea trolley and was blinking hard. "Aye," he said. "Kindness sometimes helps as well." Marjorie's eyes hardened, but her smile remained. "Constable, I am sure village policing has its own charming customs. Hospitality at this level is a serious business. So I'm seeing—" Mr. Halberton Smythe cleared his throat. "Miss Vane has very strong ideas. She has invoices," said his wife softly. Marjorie turned. "And access to the London office, which is more useful. If Tommel Castle is to survive the season, sentimentality must give way to discipline." Her voice was calm, yet every word was placed like a pin. Hamish saw Mrs. Halberton Smythe stiffen. He also saw 3 staff members suddenly become very interested in a tray of scones. He adopted the easy, half-foolish look that often served him well. "Well, I dare say nobody ever solved anything on an empty stomach. Is that smoked salmon I'm smelling?" The tension loosened by a hair. Mr. Halberton Smythe almost smiled. Marjorie looked at him as if he had confirmed something unfortunate. "A local policeman with an appetite," she said. "How authentic." Hamish let that pass. He had found that vanity and anger often worked harder, if not interrupted. A barman was preparing a small demonstration for several guests near a sideboard. At the centre of it stood a decorative cask on a wooden cradle, made to look older than it was. The man, broad-shouldered and careful with his hands, had the dark good looks of someone who knew charm was part of the trade. Hamish heard a guest call him Alasdair. "And this," Alasdair was saying, "is one of the hotel's heritage casks, kept for private tastings. Tommel likes to remind its guests the Highlands still know a good thing when they see it." There was a little murmur of appreciation. He lifted the cask slightly to show the red wax seal fixed over the bung. It bore the Tommel stag crest in a handsome old-fashioned stamp. Hamish, who had drifted nearer under cover of politeness and curiosity, noticed a tiny fault in the impression. One side of the stag's antlers carried a faint second line, as if the stamp had been nicked and pressed twice in one breath. It was the sort of detail nobody sensible would care about. Hamish looked at it a second longer than was necessary, and then forgot it, or thought he did. Lugs rose and ambled over in search of crumbs. One of the titled ladies exclaimed in surprise as his nose approached her sandwich. Hamish caught him by the collar. "Leave off," he murmured. "You're no invited to high tea, however grand your opinion of yourself." The lady laughed. A few others did as well. Even Mr. Halberton Smythe relaxed a fraction. The dog had done more for the atmosphere in a minute than Marjorie Vane had managed in an hour. Marjorie, however, was watching the cask rather than the guests. "Your seal is slightly irregular," she said to Alasdair. He looked blank. "Miss, the wax impression. There is a flaw in the mark. One expects consistency in authenticity displays." For the first time that afternoon, Hamish saw someone meet her eye without shrinking. Alasdair smiled. It was a professional smile, polished and shallow. "It's an old stamp, miss. That's part of the charm. Charm is what people sell when they cannot offer proof," said Marjorie. The remark landed badly. Mr. Halberton Smythe coloured. His wife looked as if she might like to throw a teacup, but had been raised too well. Hamish said, very mildly, "There's weather enough outside without bringing more indoors." Marjorie turned that cool stare on him. "And there are accounts enough indoors without pretending weather is the problem." The snow hissed at the windows. Somewhere down the corridor, a door banged and was shut again quickly. For a brief moment, the hotel seemed less like a house of luxury than a place under siege. Hamish had a sudden, strong impression that Marjorie Vane took pleasure in weakness. Not merely in finding it, but in arranging people so they had to feel it. He moved aside with Mr. Halberton Smythe, on the pretext of admiring the view. "You asked for a quiet word," said Hamish. The older man rubbed at his temple. "Did I? I suppose I did. Matters are delicate." "They often are." "We are under pressure," said Mr. Halberton Smythe. The season was poor. Repairs cost more than expected. The owners in London thought a standards review would reassure investors. Miss Vane was recommended. "By an enemy?" The man gave a pained little huff of laughter. "You see the difficulty? Have staff complained?" "Not formally." "They wouldn't," said Hamish. "Not if they thought they might lose their jobs." Mr. Halberton Smythe stared down at the loch. "We cannot afford a scandal." Hamish followed his gaze. The water lay dark and still beneath the whitening slopes. Snow softened the hills, but it did nothing for worry. It only made the world look quieter, while men's minds did their shouting indoors. "I'll keep an eye on it," said Hamish. "That's about all I can promise today. That may be more than anyone else can." When Hamish turned back, Marjorie Vane was writing in her notebook again. Her face was composed. Her pen moved with neat, relentless strokes. The staff shifted around her, like people learning the path of a cold draught. He did not like her. That in itself meant little. There were plenty of unlikable people in the Highlands, and not all of them came to a bad end. Still, he had learned to trust the small tightening behind his eyes when something in a room was wrong. As he left, Lugs had to be coaxed from the carpet by means of a devilled egg and a promise he could not possibly assess. Marjorie watched them go with faint distaste, as if both dog and policeman belonged to an older, less efficient Scotland. Hamish put on his cap and stepped out into the whitening dusk. Behind him, Tommel Castle glowed against the snow like a place determined to look prosperous at any cost. Ahead of him, the road to Lochs was already beginning to vanish. Chapter 2. Snowed in, smiled at, and insulted. By evening the road had become more idea than fact. Snow lay thick along the verges and drifted across the bends in soft white ridges. The hills had vanished behind a grey curtain. From the hotel windows the Highlands looked hushed and almost holy. But Hamish Macbeth knew weather like that could turn men fretful and women unkind. A storm in the Highlands shut more than roads. It shut tempers in with one another. He had meant to go back to Lochs after his visit, but halfway down the drive he met the Tommel minibus creeping up from the village with 2 stranded guests and a driver who looked alarmed by every flake that touched the windscreen. The man leaned out and shouted that the road below had iced over near the bend, and nobody was advising travel unless they fancied a ditch. Hamish turned the Land Rover and went back up. Tommel Castle had taken on the close, overheated air of a place pretending not to panic. In the hall, 2 guests were demanding the use of the telephone. A chambermaid hurried past with extra blankets. Somewhere, A bell rang and rang before being snatched silent. Luggs, who had appointed himself inspector of carpets, had found a second favourable patch near a radiator and lay across it as if he were part of the furnishings. Mrs. Halberton Smythe met Hamish in the corridor with a look of determined breeding. "How unfortunate," she said. "It seems we are all staying." "For the moment," said Hamish. "Best keep folk calm. We are trying." Her eyes went past him toward the lounge. Marjorie Vane was standing there with her notebook open, speaking to the receptionist in a tone both low and cutting. Even at a distance, she managed to make disapproval look methodical. "What is she after now?" asked Hamish. "Everything," said Mrs. Halberton Smythe. "Menus, rota sheets, purchase orders, staff training notes. She has now requested the accounts." "Has she?" "She says the owners expect full transparency." Hamish looked at her face. "And do they?" Mrs. Halberton Smythe gave a brittle little smile. "Owners expect miracles, Constable. Transparency is merely their preferred word for blame." Marjorie turned and came toward them. Her step was brisk, her expression composed. But there was a brightness in her eye that Hamish disliked. It was not fear, it was appetite. "Constable," she said. "Still here?" "So it appears. Then perhaps you can be useful. We have guests delayed, staff overwrought, and systems that border on the theatrical." "A hotel often does," said Hamish. She ignored that. "I require access to the cellar records and the main account ledgers. There are inconsistencies in the stock display." Mrs. Halberton Smythe stiffened. "That is not your concern this evening." "On the contrary," said Marjorie. "When money is tight, authenticity becomes everyone's concern." The word dropped between them. Hamish saw Mrs. Halberton Smythe colour and then go pale. He said lazily, "You've a grand talent for cheer, Miss Vane." Marjorie looked at him as one might look at a draught entering under a door. "And you have a grand talent for rustic irony, Constable. I suppose it passes for charm locally." "Aye," said Hamish. "And sometimes for manners as well." For a second her face sharpened. Then she smiled again. "If you will excuse me." She moved off down the passage toward the office. Hamish watched her go, and thought that some people did not merely walk into a room, they took possession of the air. In the kitchen things were better. Kitchens, he had always thought, belonged to necessity, and therefore to sanity. The chef had a pan on the range and steam on his spectacles. Someone was slicing bread. A pot of soup sent up a rich smell of leeks and stock. Through the small back window he could see snow piling on the yard wall. The cook, a broad woman with flour on one cheek, handed him a mug without asking whether he wanted one. "It's broth," she said. "Before the management remembers we're human and sets us polishing spoons again." Hamish took it gratefully. "That's kind." "It's no kindness. It's self-preservation. We're all dropping where we stand." At the far end of the kitchen, near the warm door that led toward the service stairs, a pair of yellow eyes glinted from the shadows. Sonsie had appeared soundlessly, as he often did, wild and self-possessed, his striped body half hidden behind a sack of potatoes. One of the kitchen lads tossed him a scrap. Sonsie snatched it and vanished with the fierce speed of something that had never been properly domesticated. "There's your housebreaker," said the cook. "He goes where he likes," said Hamish. "So does that auditor woman," muttered the chef darkly. This was the sort of sentence Hamish liked. It usually meant the speaker had more to say. "She's making friends, then?" he asked. The chef snorted. "If by friends you mean enemies, aye. She's been through every corridor but the chimney. Told Morag her hands were clumsy. Told Jean in laundry the linen inventory was disgraceful. And told me my menu was aspirational. That sounds painful." She asked how much of the venison was truly local. "I said it came from a deer that would be offended by the question." That got a tired laugh from the others. Then the kitchen porter, who had been peeling carrots with unnecessary force, said, "She wants in the cellar again." The chef turned. "Again?" "Aye. I heard her telling Mr. Halberton Smythe she needed the whisky ledger. Said she'd compare stock, invoices, and authenticity markers." Hamish looked up from his broth. "Authenticity markers?" The porter shrugged. Her words, not mine. She spoke as if the whiskey was a bank robbery. The chef lowered his voice. There's talk she'll send a report to London. Some rescue package, some investors, some new arrangement. That's what she said to the manager. Rescue or ruin, depending who's telling it. And what do you think? Hamish asked. I think folk who say they're here to save a place usually mean they'll own it by the time they're done. Hamish drank the last of his broth and set down the mug. The warmth of it sat pleasantly in his stomach. It reminded him how much he preferred plain good food to hotel fuss. He could already imagine Blair, if he came, complaining about the weather and then eating as if resentment sharpened his appetite. As Hamish left the kitchen, he nearly collided with Morag, the young waitress from the lounge. Her eyes were red. You all right? He asked. Yes, constable. That meant no, of course. He waited. She said I smile too much at the wrong moment, Morag blurted. I did not know there was a correct quantity. Hamish leaned one shoulder against the wall. There is nay. Some folk just can't bear to see another person easy in themselves. Morag gave a shaky laugh. Did she say anything else? He asked. She asked if I had ever been below in the whiskey cellar. I said only to fetch extra glasses. Then she wanted to know who had keys, and whether the ledgers matched what was shown to guests. Morag swallowed. It was as if she thought somebody here was lying. Did she say who? No. Only this. Morag lowered her voice and imitated Marjorie's cool precision surprisingly well. People lie when money is tight. Hamish's eyes narrowed a little. That sounded less like criticism and more like a line she had come prepared to use. He wandered next through the back corridor and down toward the office. The carpet there was thinner, the walls less decorative, and the true pulse of the hotel could be heard in distant footsteps, service bells, and the rattle of trays. Through a partly open door he saw Marjorie at a desk, making neat columns in her notebook beside a spread of invoices and stock sheets. Her handwriting was obsessively tidy, each line ruled by control. One heading caught his eye before she turned the page. Cellar, seal condition, bottle count, authenticity markers. She looked up at once. Do Highland policemen make a habit of spying through office doors? She asked. Only when the scenery is interesting. I doubt you understand what you're looking at. That's often an advantage. She gave him a long, measuring stare. This hotel has lived on appearances. Appearances are expensive. I am merely determining which lies cost the most. That's a bleak wee hobby. It is a profitable one. Hamish let his gaze fall to the papers, then back to her face. You seem mighty interested in the whiskey. Guests pay for illusion. Investors pay for proof. And which are you? Her mouth tightened. I am the person sent when politeness has failed. That, Hamish thought, was probably the truest thing she had said all day. From the front of the hotel came the murmur of guests settling in for dinner arrangements, each pretending to be inconvenienced rather than trapped. Snow tapped softly at the glass. The air smelled faintly of polish, coal smoke, and nerves. Hamish went back through the lounge and looked out at the white dark pressing against the windows. In the village below, lamps would be coming on one by one. At Patel's shop there would already be speculation. Mrs. Wellington would be drawing conclusions over supper. Nessie and Jessie Curry would be improving the facts for moral purposes. By morning, half of Lochdube would know there was trouble at Tommel Castle, and the other half would claim they had said so first. Behind him, Marjorie Vane's voice rose again in the corridor, cool and exact, asking for the cellar keys. Hamish did not turn at once. He stood with his hands in his pockets, listening to the snow hiss softly against the windows and thinking that the hotel had begun to feel less like a place cut off by weather than one shut in with its own secrets. And somewhere below, in the old stone under the carpets and the silver, the whiskey cellar waited. Chapter 3. The Cold Open Ends. The hotel tried to proceed, as if dinner were a constitutional necessity. Candles were lit in the dining room. Silver covers shone. Guests who had been merely inconvenienced by snow began to discover the strange pleasure of shared confinement, provided the wine was good and the company inferior. In the corridor outside, a maid was still taking extra blankets to two ladies from Edinburgh who spoke of the weather as if it had been arranged personally against them. Hamish Macbeth would have preferred to be home. He stood for a moment at a side window and looked out over the dark of the loch. Snow moved across it in slanting white veils. The road below had disappeared entirely now. The hills were gone. The world seemed reduced to the yellow hotel windows, the black water, and the old silence that came when Highland weather shut men in with themselves. Lugs pressed his cold nose against Hamish's hand. "You're thinking of your supper," said Hamish softly. Lugs wagged, thus admitting nothing. A waiter came by with a tray of small pies meant for the cocktail hour before dinner. Hamish took one on behalf of the law and gave half to the dog, which vanished in an instant. He ate the other half himself and thought that while Tommel Castle fussed too much over food, it at least understood that pastry improved most crises. Marjorie Vane, however, seemed proof against improvement. She was in the hall speaking to Mr. Halberton Smythe with the calm force of a person driving nails into soft wood. Hamish caught only pieces as he drifted past. "Not tomorrow. Tonight. Miss Vane, the guests are a symptom. I am discussing the disease." Then she saw Hamish and altered her tone without warming it. "Constable, I understand the cellar is below the East Passage." "That would depend where one starts," said Hamish. Mr. Halberton Smythe gave him a look almost of appeal. "Miss Vane wishes to review the whisky storage once more." "At this hour?" Hamish asked. "At the correct hour," said Marjorie. "Inventory does not improve by waiting." Hamish studied her face. She looked excited in a pinched, unpleasant way, as if she scented not merely failure but opportunity. "I'd leave it till morning," he said mildly. "Stone stairs and a storm are poor companions." She smiled at him. "How gallant." "But this is not a fairy tale, Constable Macbeth. It is an audit." She moved off before he could answer, notebook under her arm, heels tapping briskly on the floorboards. Mr. Halberton Smythe watched her go and passed a hand over his eyes. "She has threatened to telephone London first thing," he said. "About the whisky?" "About everything." "That's a large subject." "Yes," said Mr. Halberton Smythe bleakly, "and she enjoys it." Dinner went in late, which was enough to be spoken of for years by the sort of guests who dined chiefly to report upon it later. Hamish did not sit down with them. He took a plate in the kitchen instead, preferring a chair by the range and the company of people too busy to perform themselves. The chef sent him a dish of venison stew with mashed potatoes, and a look that demanded justice in general, if not in law. "This," said Hamish after a mouthful, "is far better than anything in Inverness Canteen." "That," said the chef, "would include boiled boots." At the back door, Sonsie appeared, vast and stripy, his wild yellow eyes narrowed against the warmth. He did not come in at once. He stood, all suspicion and hunger, then slipped along the wall with that fierce, untamed economy that made domestic cats seem merely decorative. Lugs, hopeful of fellowship, gave half a wag. Sonsie ignored him with professional contempt. "You're no getting my stew," Hamish told the dog. Lugs sighed heavily and put his head on Hamish's knee. It was while Hamish was finishing the last of the gravy with bread that the first note of wrongness entered the evening. It came not as a scream but as an absence. A young footman appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face had gone the colour of uncooked dough. "Has anyone seen Miss Vane?" The chef looked up irritably. "Not since she was making a martyr of herself in the corridor." She was to have the inspection debrief with Mr. Halberton Smythe before dinner. She never came. The cook wiped her hands on her apron. "Maybe she's counting teaspoons somewhere." But Hamish was already rising. "Where was she last seen?" "Near the East Passage, sir," said the footman. "Heading for the office. Or the cellar. I'm not sure." Hamish set down his plate. Lugs stood at once, sensing purpose. From somewhere behind the coal box, Sonsie's head lifted sharply, ears pricked. The East Passage lay beyond the public rooms, where the wallpaper became older and the carpets less forgiving. A row of weak yellow bulbs lit the service corridor. There was a smell of polish, damp wool, and old stone rising from below. Halfway down, Morag the waitress stood wringing her hands, while the assistant manager fluttered uselessly beside her. "She's not in the office," Morag said, "and the cellar door's open." Hamish went past them and looked down the stone stairs. At first he saw only the light, a dim yellow globe swinging slightly on its wire. Then the shape at the bottom came into sense. Marjorie Vane lay twisted where the steps turned toward the cellar passage. One arm was under her. Her head was at an angle no living head would keep. Her notebook had fallen open beside her, pages bent back. A pencil lay 2 steps above. For a moment, the whole thing had the ugly stillness of a discarded puppet. Hamish felt the familiar inward groan. There went his quiet life again. "No one come down," he said sharply. The assistant manager gave a little moan. Morag put a hand to her mouth. Lugs, halted by Hamish's leg, let out a low, puzzled sound deep in his throat. Hamish went down carefully. The stone steps were cold underfoot. They smelt faintly of damp oak and whisky. At the bottom, he crouched beside the body and touched the wrist, though he already knew the skin had the chill of stone. There was no blood to speak of, only the dreadful wrongness of the fall and a small, dark mark hidden near the hairline. He looked up the stair. An accident was what most people would call it. The stairs were narrow. The storm had everyone off balance. She could have slipped. She could have missed a footing, turned an ankle, struck her head, but Hamish did not like what he saw. On the rail, midway down, was a faint smear of red wax. It was no bigger than the mark of a careless thumb, but it stood out against the polished wood. A little lower, on the edge of one step, was a clean scuff, pale against the darker stone, as if something heavy had been steadied or braced there rather than tumbling freely. He looked again at Marjorie's shoes. Sensible enough heels. Not ideal, but not foolish. He looked at her hand. No splinter of rail in the palm, no desperate clawing. Then he noticed that one of her sleeves smelled faintly, very faintly, of whisky. Not drink. Cellar air. He stood and turned to the watching faces above. "Go fetch Dr. Brodie," he said, "and call Inverness. Tell them we've a death at Tommel Castle." The assistant manager swallowed. "Do you mean murder?" "I mean a death," said Hamish. "We'll let the others choose their own excitement." News travelled through the hotel with the usual speed of bad news and the added efficiency of servants. By the time Dr. Brodie arrived in a storm coat over his dinner jacket, the guests had all discovered there was something the management was not saying, which made them considerably more interested than if they had been told the plain truth. Dr. Brodie went down the steps with Hamish, knelt briefly, and rose with his mouth set. "She's dead, so I thought." "You often do," said Brodie. "Any sign of life when she was found?" "None." Dr. Brodie looked at the body, then at the rail, then back at Hamish. "I'm not writing this up as a simple tumble until someone much grander than me tells me why." "That'll please him," said Hamish. He was bound to be displeased anyway. Blair arrived in grand style an hour later, all bluster, wet overcoat, and bad temper. He came in from the storm with snow on his shoulders, a cigarette between his fingers, and the smell of stale whisky travelling a step ahead of him. His fat features were flushed from the cold. His small eyes were already hunting for someone to blame. "Macbeth!" he roared before he was properly in the hall. "What the hell have ye done now?" Several guests, who had been pretending not to listen, turned openly. Hamish leaned against the newel post and looked as blank as possible. "Evening, sir." "Don't evening, sir, me, ye great streak of idleness. I've half of Inverness hearing there's a corpse in a luxury hotel, and your wee village name all over it. Important people are stranded here." "Aye," said Hamish. "And one of them's dead." Blair glared at him, breathing hard through his nose. "Accident, is it?" "Might be," mimicked Blair savagely. "A woman falls down a flight of stairs in bad weather. That's an accident, unless some idiot starts making a circus of it." Mr. Halberton Smythe, pale and stiff, came forward. "Chief Inspector, Miss Vane had been making certain allegations." Blair swung toward him at once, the smell of smoke and old whisky thickening the air. "What allegations?" "About the hotel finances. About stock irregularities." There was a pause. It changed the room. Guests stopped pretending to whisper. Mrs. Halberton Smythe sat down suddenly on a hall chair. Somewhere in the back corridor, a glass broke. Lugs, who disliked shouting, moved to Hamish's side and leaned against his leg. From the dark beneath a side table, Sonsie stared out with yellow eyes and a bristling tail. Blair's face altered. He did not become clever, but he became alert in the direction of embarrassment. "Who knew this?" he demanded. "Staff heard enough," said Hamish. "So your whole nest of gossips will be singing by midnight. They generally are." Blair stabbed the air with his cigarette. "Right. Nobody leaves. Nobody talks to the press. And you, Macbeth, will keep out of my way for once in your lazy Highland life." Hamish let his face stay empty, but his eyes went, just once more, to the faint red smear on the stair rail and the clean scuff on the stone. The cellar below smelled of oak, damp, and old lies, and he knew, before Blair had finished roaring, that Marjorie Vane had not simply slipped. Chapter 4. Canteen Gravy, Castle Sauce. Blair believed in two things above all others: noise and procedure. By 9 the next morning he had already produced both in quantity. Snow still lay heavy on the road, though the plough had cut a grudging track down toward Inverness. The sky was low and white. The loch looked like cold metal. Tommel Castle, seen in daylight, appeared less grand than weary, as if it had spent the night holding its breath. Hamish had been up since dawn. He had walked the drive once for the sake of thinking, and once because lugs insisted upon breakfast, requiring exercise. The dog had bounded ahead through the crusted snow and come back powdered white along the belly. From the low wall by the service yard, Sonsie had watched them with bright yellow eyes, fierce and still as a carved idol. Inside, the gossip had ripened overnight. A maid in tears had told the breakfast room that the police suspected everyone. A guest from Glasgow had improved this into a smuggling ring. By 8 o'clock, the Curry sisters, who had not set foot on the grounds, had somehow sent up the opinion through Mrs. Wellington that luxury hotels were nests of vice and poor laundering. Hamish did not ask how. In Lochdube the truth travelled on foot, but scandal flew. He was in the front hall, speaking quietly to Morag, when Blair's voice rolled out from the lounge like furniture being thrown downstairs. "Macbeth! In the car! Now!" Hamish went in. Blair stood by the fire with his coat half-buttoned and a cigarette going despite the smell of breakfast. He looked swollen with lack of sleep and grievance. "What for?" asked Hamish. "For a briefing at Inverness. We've a body here. We've also reports to file, superiors to satisfy, and a fiscal who'll want more than your dreamy Highland shrug." "Move yourself," Mr. Halberton Smythe began. "Chief Inspector, is that really—" "It is what I say it is," barked Blair. "The hotel can stand 5 minutes without Constable Macbeth standing about looking decorative." Hamish looked at him with mild patience. "I'm really decorative, sir." "Don't be clever." So they drove. The road down from Tommel was a slush of half-cleared snow and dirty ice. Blair cursed every bend, every drift, every cautious driver. He drove as if insulted by weather and by the existence of other men. Hamish sat beside him in patient silence, which annoyed Blair more than argument would have done. Below them the village lay dim in the white morning. Smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere, Patel's shop would already be full of women buying one thing and collecting 6 others in talk. Blair broke the silence first. "This is what comes of letting ye loiter in that place," he said. "Rich guests, old hotel, 1 dead woman, and every fool for 20 miles thinking it's a great drama. It may yet disappoint them. It will no disappoint me if it turns out a simple fall and I can shut the whole damned business by noon." Hamish watched the white road sliding under them. "And if it doesn't?" Blair gave him a thick look. "Then somebody pushed her, and we'll find who. It'll likely be one of the staff. These places are always the same. Resentment in aprons. That's a broad theory. It has the virtue of convenience." Hamish smiled faintly and looked out of the window. Convenience, in Blair's hands, was often mistaken for intelligence. The canteen at Inverness police station was doing its best to turn food into punishment. Blair led the way in with official impatience and took a trayful of brown items under a brown gravy. Hamish followed more cautiously and received a plate of something that had once aspired to be stew. The tea looked tired. The bread sweated. Blair attacked his meal as if it had personally offended him. "Well," he demanded between mouthfuls, "what have ye got beyond a dead auditor and a rail with muck on it?" "Wax." "Muck. Wax. Likely from the whiskey seal, Blair snorted. You and your wee details. Hamish pushed at a potato that offered resistance. Small things matter. No, Macbeth. Motive matters. Opportunity matters. Temper matters. Somebody disliked her. She went down the stairs. End of story. Aye, said Hamish. But which somebody? Blair shoved a forkful into his mouth and spoke around it. Anyone she spoke to for more than 30 seconds. The woman was poison. We've statements from staff saying she humiliated them, threatened jobs, demanded access to the accounts. That'll do for a beginning. Hamish drank the tea and regretted it at once. What about the whiskey ledger? He asked. Blair looked up. What about it? She was asking after it the day before. She asked after everything. Not in the same way. Blair stabbed the plate. I am no building a murder case out of tasting notes and hotel theatrics. Hamish looked around the canteen. Men bent over grey food under strip lights. A radio muttered the weather. 2 constables nearby were discussing football with the dead intensity men reserved for matters they could not influence. In that room, Blair's method made a sort of sense. It belonged to lists, signatures, and whoever could be shouted at quickest. But Tommel Castle was not a canteen. It was a house full of manners, pretense, and things hidden under polish. He set down his fork. Then maybe I'll do the listening while you do the shouting. Blair glared. I heard that. I meant ye to. For a second, Hamish thought Blair might throw something. Instead, he leaned back and wiped his mouth. You think yourself smart because you're local, he said. Because folk talk to ye. Because you creep about with that vacant face and they mistake it for innocence. It helps. It makes me sick. Aye, said Hamish. So does the gravy. That nearly cost him. But Blair only made a noise like a blocked drain and hauled himself up. There followed the miserable briefing, the predictable instruction to avoid press chatter, and a good deal of paper waved in self-importance. By the time Hamish got back into the car, he wanted only decent food and a room where nobody said procedure as if it were a sacrament. The road up to Tommel had worsened again. The snow had begun afresh, finer this time, but persistent. The hotel loomed out of it like a stage set painted by a man with debts. Back inside, the warmth hit him, followed by the smell of stock, onions, and baking bread drifting from the kitchen. It was the kind of smell that repaired a man's faith in the world more effectively than sermons. Lugs, who had spent the morning in disgraceful comfort near the boiler room, trotted toward him and at once began sniffing every trouser leg in the service corridor like a customs officer with strong opinions. Hamish let him. Dogs often discovered what men concealed in posture, if not in scent. The cook took one look at his face and put a bowl before him. Soup, she said. And no complaints, because I've had a morning of murder, management, and meringue. Hamish sat gratefully at the scrubbed kitchen table. The soup was thick and hot and honest. Beside it came a heel of bread and a wedge of cheese. In 2 spoonfuls, the police canteen ceased to seem like part of civilized life. Now, said the cook, folding her arms, watch that great buffalo from Inverness saying that he'll solve it before breakfast. It's after breakfast. Aye. He's fallen behind. The kitchen laughed in tired relief. Laughter in such places was often less amusement than defiance. Hamish ate and listened. It came in bits, as useful truth often did. Marjorie had been in the office again after tea. Marjorie had asked twice for the cellar ledger and once for old stock invoices. Marjorie had gone below with Alasdair Muir, the head barman, some time before dinner, though nobody agreed whether they had gone together or one after the other. She had returned alone, or perhaps not alone. The accounts clerk said she heard raised voices through the office door. The scullery maid swore she heard Marjorie say someone was cheating the whole concept. That phrase struck Hamish as so very like her that he believed it at once. What about exact words? He asked. The kitchen porter, who had been waiting to contribute, said, I heard better than that. Everyone turned. He shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. Only because I was fetching the crate from the back passage and the office door was ajar. She said, You are selling the hotel's soul by the bottle. The room went still. Hamish set down his spoon. To whom? The porter frowned. I couldn't swear, a man's voice answered. Low, angry. But I only heard the end. Alasdair? Asked the chef. Might have been, said Hamish softly. At that moment, a striped shape slid along the far wall and vanished into the passage that led toward the cellar. Sonsie, all stealth and bad intentions, had chosen her own line of inquiry. No one tried to stop her. Hamish looked after her, then back at the kitchen staff. The ledger, he said. Who had charge of it? The chef jerked his head toward the office. Officially, the manager. In practice, the barman handled all whiskey stock because he knew the suppliers and the guests with money enough to ask questions. Hamish leaned back. The kitchen warmth, the decent soup, the tired, truthful faces before him. This was where cases began to open. Not under Blair's roar. Not under strip lights and bad gravy. Here, where people were fed enough to speak and angry enough to forget caution. Lugs left off sniffing a footman's cuffs and came to rest his chin on Hamish's knee. Outside, the snow thickened on the windows. Somewhere below, in the stone belly of the hotel, the cellar kept its own counsel. But Hamish now had a sentence he did not mean to lose. Selling the hotel's soul by the bottle. That was not the language of a slip on the stairs. Chapter 5. Hamish tries to be kind. By mid-morning the snow had begun again, fine as salt. It blew across the drive and gathered in the corners of the windows, softening the view of the loch until water and sky were almost the same pale threat. Tommel Castle had settled into that particular kind of strain which passes for calm in respectable places. Breakfast was over. Lunch had not yet begun. Guests were being managed, reassured, and lied to in careful tones. Hamish Macbeth knew the signs. He had seen it in cottages, inns, police stations, and once at a village fete where the treasurer had vanished with the raffle money. When people were frightened of scandal, they stopped asking what was true and began asking what sounded best. He was standing in the office with Mr. and Mrs. Halberton Smythe when he made the mistake. It did not feel like a mistake then. Mr. Halberton Smythe looked haggard. His collar sat crooked. Mrs. Halberton Smythe had the bright stillness of a woman holding her breath for too long. Bills, ledgers, and room lists covered the desk in anxious little piles. There was a smell of cold ink, furniture polish, and panic. "We cannot have the guests saying there has been a murder," said Mrs. Halberton Smythe. "Not until something is certain." "In a hotel?" said Hamish. "They'll be saying it already." "But must staff repeat it?" she asked sharply. "Must there be drama in the corridors?" Hamish leaned one shoulder against the filing cabinet and thought it over. He had no wish to help them hide anything. He disliked that sort of polish over rot, but he disliked public cruelty even more, and he had seen the strain on the younger staff. "Best keep folk calm," he said. "No point in turning the whole place into a fair. Tell the staff to say as little as they can till Blair's done stomping about. Less talk means fewer daft rumours." Mr. Halberton Smythe looked relieved enough to embrace him. "Quite so. Calm. Dignity." Mrs. Halberton Smythe nodded briskly, already translating his words into management. "Exactly." Hamish had the faint thought that something had slipped sideways. He ought perhaps to have said more, or less. But at that moment Lugs wandered in, and put his wet nose against his hand, and the instant passed. "You've had your breakfast," Hamish told him. Lugs wagged in case there had been an administrative error. Hamish left the office and walked through the lounge. It was fuller now. Snowed-in guests had begun to form temporary alliances based on class, boredom, and grievance. A retired colonel was explaining Scottish weather to a woman from Surrey who had never asked. Two sisters in pearls were sharing alarm with relish. Near the fire, Priscilla Halberton Smythe stood with a cup in her hand, looking cool and composed in a dark green skirt and a cream blouse that seemed untouched by the crisis. Hamish stopped. Priscilla turned, and for a moment her face softened. Then she took in his expression, and it cooled again into its usual intelligent reserve. "You look as if you have slept in a chair," she said. "I may have. That is because you insist on drifting about like a benevolent ghost, instead of behaving like a policeman." "I am behaving like a policeman. One of Blair's sort, perhaps." Hamish grinned, despite himself. "That's harsh." Priscilla glanced toward the office. "My stepmother has been telling everyone the hotel is handling matters with tact, which generally means with silence." Hamish's smile faded. Did she say that? She has said it in 3 different ways to 3 different people, which suggests she means to keep saying it until it becomes true. Hamish looked back at the office door. Aye, he said slowly. That's about the size of it. Priscilla studied him. What did you advise? Only that they keep guests calm. And they heard, no doubt, that they should keep the truth quiet. That's no the same thing. It seldom is, said Priscilla. But people under strain prefer useful misunderstandings. He looked at her properly then. There was no malice in her face, only that chilly precision she reserved for moments when she thought him softer than wise. I was trying to save the girls from being hounded, he said. I know, she said. That made it worse. He went out before he could say something foolish. In the yard the wind had freshened, coming sharp off the loch. Snow hissed along the stones. From the low wall, Sonsie watched him with wild yellow eyes, her striped body drawn tight against the cold. He held out a hand. She did not come, but neither did she go. You're wiser than I am, he told her. She blinked once, disdainful and unconvinced. The gossip reached Lochdub before noon. Hamish knew this because Patels called the hotel to ask, in the warm, courteous voice of a man pretending not to ask, whether the roads might open later, and whether it was true a chambermaid had been dismissed for upsetting the guests. Mrs. Patel, heard faintly in the background, was clearly serving someone who had come in for stamps and remained for moral instruction. By 12:30, Nessie Curry had rung the front desk and demanded to speak to Hamish on grounds of civic emergency. The receptionist, pale and resentful, transferred the call. Hamish took it in the small office off the back corridor. It's all over the village, said Nessie at once. All over, said Jessie. Close enough to the receiver to sound like a ghost. What is? Asked Hamish. That you're helping the grand folk smother it. Smother it, said Jessie. Hamish shut his eyes briefly. I'm no helping anybody smother anything. Well, that's not the story, said Nessie. The story is, there's been murder in that place, and one poor lass has been marched out crying because she spoke the truth. Crying, said Jessie. Who told you that? Mrs. Wellington heard it from a cousin of a girl who does laundry. And Mrs. Patel says a man from the fish van said the police are keeping it quiet to protect the quality. The quality, repeated Jessie with venom. Hamish rubbed a hand over his face. Listen to me. Nobody's protecting the quality. There was a silence charged with unbelief. Then Nessie said, You'd best make that plain, Hamish Macbeth. Villagers are very patient with sin, and not at all patient with snobbery. Snobbery, said Jessie. They rang off in a manner suggesting both warning and disappointment. Hamish stood a moment with the dead receiver in his hand. The corridor outside smelled of polish and floor wax. Somewhere nearby a maid was crying in that muffled, desperate way meant not to be heard. He put down the telephone and followed the sound. He found Morag in the linen room. She stood beside a basket of napkins, with her apron twisted in both fists, eyes swollen, shoulders shaking with fury more than grief. Another maid had just left her there with tea gone cold on the shelf. What happened? Hamish asked gently. Morag swallowed. Mrs. Halberton Smythe says I am to stay out of sight till things are settled. Why? Because somebody said I'd been talking. Her mouth trembled. I never told the guests anything. I only said to Jean that Miss Vane had been awful, and now she was dead, and maybe God was just faster than management. Despite himself, Hamish nearly smiled. Then he saw the state of her, and did not. That was unwisely put, he said. I know. He took out his handkerchief and gave it to her. As she reached for it, he noticed a tiny red fleck clinging near the hem of her apron. Not thread, not jam, wax. Hold still a minute. She froze. Hamish touched the flake with one finger and lifted it away. It was no bigger than a breadcrumb, deep red. On one edge there was the faintest doubling in the pressed surface, too slight to mean anything to most eyes, and too neat to be random. Have you been near the cellar this morning? He asked. No. I swear it. Yesterday? Only to fetch glasses, and not after dinner. I swear that too. He believed her. Not because tears proved innocence. They did not. But because the wax sat there too conveniently, like a line rehearsed by the wrong actress. Did anyone touch your apron? She blinked. What? In the corridor. Kitchen. Anywhere. I don't know. Mrs. Halberton Smythe caught my arm. Jean hugged me. The footman from the stairs brushed past with blankets. Everybody's been bustling. Hamish folded the tiny flake carefully into his handkerchief. All right, he said. Say nothing about this. That's easy, said Morag bitterly. Saying nothing seems to be the fashion. He left the linen room and went straight to the cellar stairs. The passage was empty. One weak bulb buzzed overhead. The stones smelled of damp and old oak. He crouched on the step where Marjorie had fallen and examined the edge of the tread. There, caught in a shallow nick in the stone, was another speck of red wax. He scraped it up with his penknife. This one, too, showed the faint pressed double line he remembered from the Tommel stag seal. Someone had handled that seal in a hurry near the time of death, and someone wanted Morag near the idea of it. He had just straightened when Blair's roar split the corridor. Macbeth! Hamish closed his penknife and went up. Blair stood in the lounge in full public fury, thick red face gleaming, overcoat open, cigarette smoking furiously between two fingers. Around him the guests had fallen into a delighted hush. They had paid for weather and tea, and had been given theatre. What do you think you're doing? Blair shouted. Standing, mostly. Don't try your Highland idiot act with me. I hear you've been advising the hotel to keep staff quiet. Hamish felt every eye in the room come to rest on him. I told them not to start a panic. You interfered in my investigation. Blair took a step closer, stale whiskey travelling ahead of him. And now the village is bleating that some poor girl's being bullied because you're protecting aristocrats. Priscilla, across the room, went still as ice. Mrs. Halberton Smythe looked ready to disappear into the carpet. Hamish said, very quietly, I told them no such thing, but that's what's happened, has it no? Blair boomed. And now I look like a fool in front of half the county. That canny be helped, sir. A gasp ran round the room. Lugs, alarmed by the tone, came and stood against Hamish's leg. From beneath a side chair, Sonsie showed herself long enough to flatten her ears at Blair, and then withdrew. Blair's piggy eyes narrowed. You're asking for transfer. Am I? Aye. Or promotion. That'd punish ye proper. Stick ye in Inverness with paperwork, and no time to moon about lochs with your dog. At that, Hamish's voice changed. It went softer and more sibilant, the Highland edges sharpening under the calm. If you're done performing, sir, there's a frightened lass being made a scapegoat and a dead woman on the stairs. I'd rather attend to them than your pride. The room fell utterly quiet. Blair stared at him, breathing hard. Then, because he could not retreat and could not win, he turned to the guests and barked that no one was to leave the premises, no one was to speak to the press, and no one was to listen to village nonsense. This last instruction guaranteed that every soul present would do exactly that. Hamish stood still until the shouting passed. In his pocket, wrapped in his handkerchief, lay the 2 red flakes of wax. His kindness had made a mess, but the mess, he thought, had begun to show its shape. Chapter 6. A perfect suspect in a messy place. The snow held. It lay over Tommel Castle and the road below, like a decision already made. The loch had turned the dull colour of pewter. The wind worried at the windows now and then, but even that seemed tired. Indoors, tempers had gone from sharp to weary. People could not remain dramatic forever. In the Highlands, even panic had to stop for tea. By early afternoon, Blair had what he liked best in any inquiry: a simple story. Hamish Macbeth had it laid out for him in the lounge, where the guests had retreated behind newspapers, card games, and the pretence of indifference. Lugs lay sprawled near the fire like an old hearth-rug that had developed opinions. Every so often he opened one blue eye, judged the company disappointing, and sank back into sleep. Blair stood over Hamish with a notebook in one hand and triumph in every fold of his red face. The chef, he said. Who else? Hamish said nothing at first. Blair took this for encouragement. He hated her. Half the staff heard her insulting him. She threatened jobs. She was sniffing round the cellar and the accounts. He's a big fellow, used to lifting crates and joints of meat. She mouths off. He loses his temper, gives her a shove near the stairs. Down she goes. Easy. It is easy, said Hamish. Exactly. Blair glared, suspicious of agreement. And now we stop wasting time with wax and wee Highland impressions and charge the man." Hamish looked into the fire. There was comfort in an easy answer. That was the danger of them. The chef had motive enough. He had been openly insulted. He had cursed Marjorie Vane in the hearing of others. He worked near the back passages. He was large. Village minds would settle on him at once, and once settled, they did not like to move. There was another temptation too, and Hamish was honest enough to know it. If the chef took the blame, Morag would be left in peace. The gossip would swing off the frightened girl and onto a grown man built broad enough to carry suspicion. Priscilla came into the room carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. She set it down with efficient grace and gave Hamish one quick look. "You look thoughtful," she said. "Dangerous, that," said Hamish. "It often is when you mistake pity for evidence." Blair snorted. "Miss Halberton Smythe, we are no discussing philosophy. We are discussing a cook with a temper." Priscilla poured tea. "Then I pity the cook." Blair made a thick noise in his throat and stalked off toward the hall to terrify someone else. Priscilla handed Hamish a cup. "You are not convinced?" she said quietly. "I could be." "No," she said. "You could be tired." She moved away before he could answer. Hamish drank the tea and watched the grey light on the windows. Beyond the glass, the hills were hidden again. In the village below, he could imagine Nessie and Jessie Curry pronouncing on matters from behind scarves and steam at Patel's shop. As if summoned by thought, the front desk rang through that very minute with a call from Mrs. Patel. The receptionist, now resigned to the village governing itself by telephone, came to fetch him. Mrs. Patel's voice was warm and brisk. "I only wish to say," she said, "that Mrs. Wellington has heard the police mean to arrest the hotel cook, and the Curry sisters say, if it is true, it is what comes of serving decorative food." In the background came a faint burst of Nessie's voice, with Jessie reinforcing her. "Has Mrs. Wellington heard any reason for this?" asked Hamish. "No reason worth having," said Mrs. Patel. "But there is a man here buying tea who says his cousin delivers to Tommel and saw the cook plating dinner at the very hour of the death." Hamish straightened a little. "Saw him when?" "Near 6, he says. The cousin had come to the back entrance with bread because of the weather delays. They were all in a fluster. That's useful." "I thought so." "Also, Mrs. Wellington says if the cook is arrested, Angela Brodie will send over broth because men are never sensible in a storm. That also sounds useful." When he rang off, Hamish stood for a moment with the receiver in his hand. There it was again, the village doing police work while pretending only to exchange concern. He went straight to the kitchen. Heat hit him first, then the smell of onions, stock, and bread. The cook was rolling pastry with the focused wrath of a woman who had no time for murder. The chef stood at the range, thick arms folded, face dark with resentment. He looked up as Hamish entered. "Well," he said, "has yon buffalo arrested me yet?" "Not yet." "Then he's late." The cook gave a short laugh. Hamish leaned against the table. "Tell me exact now. Where were you when Miss Vane went down the stairs?" The chef slapped a spoon into the pot. "Here. Who saw you?" "Half the blasted kitchen. I was plating the venison. Ask them. Ask the bread lad who came to the back. Ask the porter. Ask anybody who's got eyes." The kitchen porter nodded at once. "He was here, swearing at the sauce." "It had split," said the chef. "A tragedy," said Hamish. The chef ran a hand through his hair. "I said ugly things about the woman, She deserved them. But I never went near her after 5. She came in here once more to ask whether the game stock matched the menu copy, and I told her if she wanted poetry, she could go and boil her own." "Did you touch the whiskey seal?" The chef stared. "What?" "The red wax. The cask stamp. I've enough to do with food. I leave the whiskey theatrics to Alasdair." Hamish stepped closer and took the man's hand before he could object. The fingers were broad, stained yellow with saffron near the nails, and sharp with the smell of onion and garlic. No trace of red wax showed in the ridges or under the cuticles. The other hand was the same. "When did you last scrub for service?" Hamish asked. "Just before first seating." "Why?" "No reason." "There was reason enough. If the chef had handled soft wax or a hot seal in haste, there ought to have been some trace, unless he had washed like a surgeon between murder and gravy. Yet here were saffron and onion, stubborn as truth. Hamish let go and went through to the small storage room off the corridor, where the decorative cask and sealing things had been kept for tastings. The wooden box for the Tommel stag stamp sat on the shelf. Inside lay sealing sticks, cloth, and the brass stamp handle. He lifted it gently and examined the face. There was the nick. Small, easy to miss, but when pressed into fresh red wax, it left a faint double line in the impression, just as he remembered from the cask shown at tea and from the tiny flakes found on Morag's apron and the stair-tread. Not cellar dirt, then? Not old wax fallen from some careless bottle months ago? Freshly pressed wax? Recent handling? He asked for a candle. The cook brought one, muttering that if the police set fire to her pantry she would kill somebody properly. Hamish softened a bit of sealing wax over the flame, dripped it onto a scrap of greaseproof paper, and pressed the stag stamp into it. When he lifted it, the tiny doubled line sat there plain as a confession to anyone willing to look small. Priscilla, who had come to the doorway unseen, said, "There." Hamish glanced up. "Aye? So the flakes on Morag's apron and the stair? From this stamp, and not by chance." The chef, still at the threshold, stared from the impression to Hamish. "Then I'm cleared." "Not by Blair," said Hamish. "Not yet." The chef swore softly. Hamish folded the test impression into his notebook. The false answer had just broken under his fingers, and with it went the comfort of ending things neatly. He felt the brief old weariness of it. Cases were tiresome because people were untidy. Something brushed past his leg. Sonsie emerged from under the shelf, fierce as a striped ghost, and fixed her yellow eyes on the stamp box. Her fur rose slightly along her spine. Then, with the air of having confirmed a private suspicion, she slipped back into the passage. Hamish watched her go. The chef had motive and temper, but no wax, no time, and too many witnesses. The village's tidy villain would not do, which meant the mess was beginning again. And somewhere in it, he thought, stood the man who had handled the Tommel seal in a hurry after Marjorie Vane died. Chapter 7. Sonsie's Stolen Treasure. That night the storm settled over Tommel Castle like a grudge. The snow did not fall hard now. It came softly, steadily, and without mercy, thickening the silence outside the windows and shutting the hotel more firmly into itself. The loch had vanished into the dark. The lamps by the drive showed only a little circle of whiteness, and then nothing at all. Hamish Macbeth had been given a room at the back of the hotel, partly because nobody trusted the road, and partly because nobody quite trusted the case. He did not mind the room. It was plain enough, with a narrow bed, a chair, a washstand, and a view over the service yard where the snow had drifted against the wall. He would rather have had his own cottage, damp or not. But there were worse places to think than a quiet room with bad wallpaper and a door that shut properly. Lugs had taken possession of the rug at once. He lay spread across it in a shapeless heap of fur and satisfaction, one ear turned toward Hamish in case anything edible were mentioned. The dog had eaten better at Tommel Castle in 2 days than he had any moral right to expect, and it had left him with the smug endurance of a creature convinced that hardship was for other people. Hamish sat at the small desk beneath the lamp and laid out what he had. The notebook held the test impression of the stag seal, the little doubled line plain in the wax. In his handkerchief lay the 2 small flakes he had taken from Morag's apron and the stair-tread. On the table beside them he set his own notes. Marjorie Vane asking for the whiskey ledger. Marjorie talking of authenticity markers. Marjorie accusing someone of selling the hotel's soul by the bottle. Alasdair Muir, smooth and composed, custodian of the whiskey stock and the guests' admiration. The chef cleared by time and hands. Morag, likely framed. Blair roaring in circles, because it gave him the feeling of progress. Hamish leaned back and rubbed at his eyes. "Well," he said to Lugs, "it's no the cook." Lugs thumped his tail once in vague approval. "And it's no the lass. Which leaves us with either a liar, a fool, or somebody who thinks he's cleverer than he is. That ought to narrow it down in a hotel." Lugs lifted his head, hopeful that this speech might end in sausage. There came a light scratching at the door. Hamish looked up. Lugs did as well, but without urgency. He had already judged the sound familiar. Hamish crossed the room and opened the door, a cautious hand's breadth. Sonsie slipped in sideways like a striped suspicion. She was dusted with snow along the back, her yellow eyes bright in the lamplight, her fur slightly raised from cold and temper. She paused just inside, gave Lugs a look of withering contempt, and then crossed the room with the fierce self-possession of something that had never once believed in permission. "What have you got there?" asked Hamish. Something small and metallic clinked onto his coat, which he had left over the chair. Sonsie stepped back at once, tail lashing once in irritation, as if she had discharged an unpleasant duty and wished the matter closed. Hamish bent and picked up the object. It was a brass cap from the ceiling stamp box, the sort of fitted top meant to protect the stamp head when it was stored. Red wax was smeared along one edge. He held it closer to the lamp. There it was again. The faint, irregular ridge, where the nick in the stamp had pressed into soft wax. Hamish felt the whole thing shift inside his head. "Well, now," he said softly. Lugs stood, sensing importance at last, and came over to sniff. Sonsie hissed at him without conviction, and jumped onto the bed, where she sat, wrapped about herself, vast and tigerish in the poor little room, watching Hamish with a look that implied incompetence all round. "You stole this?" Hamish told her. Sonsie blinked. "From where?" He looked down at the cap in his hand and saw, in thought, the storage room off the corridor. The shelf, the stamp box, the sealing wax, the polite little display of old Highland authenticity for rich guests. He had checked the stamp itself. He had tested the nick, but he had not paid enough attention to the box. He put on his jacket at once. Lugs, thrilled by any midnight development, bounded to the door and immediately planted himself in front of it, just as Hamish reached for the handle. The dog yawned hugely, stretched, and contrived to occupy the exact wrong place with perfect innocence. "Out of the way, you great lump." Lugs wagged and leaned harder against the door. Hamish had to edge him aside with both knees and an argument. Behind him, Sonsie made no offer of assistance. She simply watched, wild-eyed and disdainful, from the bed, like a housekeeper assessing poor standards. The corridor outside was dim and quiet. Somewhere far off, a pipe knocked in the wall. The hotel had gone to that strange half-sleep only large buildings manage, where the silence never quite hides the life inside it. Hamish moved down the back passage toward the storage room, Lugs padding after him on soft feet once the question of doors had been settled. At the service turn, he paused. The air smelled faintly of polish, cold stone, and the sweeter tang of old whiskey. Snow pressed pale against the high window at the end of the passage. He opened the storage room door and put on the light. The shelf stood just as before. The stamp box was there, but now that he looked properly, it did not sit right. There was a clean square on the dusty wood beneath it, a little to the left of where it rested now. Someone had moved it and then set it back in haste. Not quite in the same place. It was the sort of detail Blair would never notice in 10 years of shouting. Hamish lifted the box and looked under it. Nothing. Then he looked behind the folded tasting cloths stacked beside it. One had been pushed in carelessly. Behind it lay a narrow ledger board used for balancing notes during the whiskey talks. Heavier than it looked, oak-edged, clean except for one corner where the polish had been rubbed and then wiped again too hard. He held it in both hands. Heavy enough to strike, flat enough to carry no obvious stain, close enough to the cellar stairs to be used in a temper, and then hidden in a hurry. Lugs sniffed at it and sneezed. "Aye," said Hamish. "That's about my feeling as well." He set the board back exactly where he had found it and looked again at the box. The brass cap Sonsie had stolen must have come loose when someone had hurriedly replaced the stamp after using it. Not months ago, not as part of some old hotel clutter. Recently, close to the time of Marjorie Vane's death, someone had taken out the official Tommel seal, used it, replaced it badly, and disturbed the whole arrangement doing so. The question was no longer whether the murderer had handled the stamp. He had, and not merely to cover his trail. Hamish stood in the little room, the weak bulb buzzing overhead, the snow making the window glow dull white, and he felt the next part click into place. Marjorie had not just discovered missing stock or shabby books. She had discovered a performance. Tommel Castle's sold heritage along with tea and whiskey. The stag seal was proof. Theatre, reassurance. If someone were quietly swapping premium whiskey with cheaper stock, Then the seal was not decoration. It was cover, an authenticity story, he thought. That was why the wax mattered. That was why Marjorie had spoken of authenticity markers. That was why she had gone to the cellar. The murderer had not only silenced her, he had needed the hotel's own symbol of proof to keep a false story going. He closed the box carefully and set it back on the shelf. Lugs looked up at him with mild blue eyes. "All right," Hamish said. "Now we know what was being protected." The dog wagged as if he had assisted substantially. Hamish switched off the light and stood a moment in the dark passage. Somewhere below, the cellar waited in its stone silence. Above, the hotel slept badly. In the village beyond the snow, people would already be deciding tomorrow what they had always believed tonight. He turned back toward his room. He was not yet ready to accuse Alasdair Muir, but he was very close indeed to knowing why Marjorie Vane had to die. And by morning, he thought, it would be time to stop listening in corridors and make the liar speak in company. Chapter 8. The Tea-Room Reckoning. The next afternoon, the snow still held the hotel in place. It lay thick on the drive and pressed white against the windows of the high tea lounge, turning the world outside into a blur of pale sky and buried road. Inside, everything had been restored to order with the sort of determination only frightened people can manage. The silver had been polished again. The cake stands were out again. Cups chimed softly against saucers. Even murder, Tommel Castle seemed to feel, must not be allowed to spoil the service. Hamish Macbeth thought that was useful. A lounge full of guests at high tea was as good a place as any for the truth. No one could leave without making a fuss. No one could speak too freely without being overheard. And people who had spent the last day pretending composure were often at their weakest in public. He had asked Mr. Halberton Smythe to gather everyone for what he called a brief update. The man had obeyed with visible relief. Mrs. Halberton Smythe sat stiff-backed near the fire, pale but controlled. Priscilla stood near the window with a cup in one hand, watching Hamish with that cool, unreadable expression of hers, which generally meant she approved, but would not say so. Morag had been brought in as well, though Hamish had made sure she sat near Priscilla and well away from Blair's reach. Lugs lay stretched on the thick carpet, seemingly asleep, though one blue eye opened now and then to survey the room. Under a side table near the curtains, Sonsie crouched low and fierce, yellow eyes bright in the dimness. Alasdair Muir stood by the sideboard with the air of a man wishing to appear helpful without becoming noticeable. He had dressed carefully. His cuffs were immaculate. His dark hair was neat. His face wore the right expression for a hotel servant in trouble. Concerned, discreet, a little shocked, and not nearly so clever as it thought. Hamish waited until the murmur died away. "I'll no keep ye long," he said. "Chief Inspector Blair is on his way up from Inverness, but there are one or two things that ought to be made plain before more damage is done." A woman in pearls leaned forward eagerly. Mrs. Halberton Smythe gave her a look that should have frozen stronger blood. Hamish went on in his mild voice. "First, Morag MacLean has nothing to do with Miss Vane's death. She is no to be blamed, whispered about, or looked at as if she'd pushed anyone down the cellar stairs." Morag stared at him. Her face went red, then white. A small rustle moved through the room. One guest looked disappointed. Another looked embarrassed. Priscilla lowered her cup. Hamish took a folded scrap from his pocket and held it up between finger and thumb. This is why. It was the wax impression he had made from the Tommel stag seal. Even from where they sat, the red showed clearly. "Tommel uses an official seal for its heritage casks." Red wax, stamped with the stag crest. He turned it slightly. "There's a tiny nick in the stamp, small enough most folk would never notice, but it leaves a faint double line in the impression." He passed the scrap first to Priscilla, who glanced at it, and then handed it on to Mr. Halberton Smythe. A few guests craned. One elderly man produced spectacles. Hamish continued. "I found fresh red wax on the cellar stair tread, and another bit on Morag's apron. Both showed the same mark. That would have been convenient for anyone wanting a simple culprit." Morag made a small sound in her throat. Mrs. Halberton Smythe put down her cup carefully. "I told her to stay out of sight," she said in a low voice. "I thought I was protecting the hotel." "You were helping the wrong story," said Hamish gently. At that moment the doors opened, and Blair came in as if he meant to storm a fortress. He was red-faced from the cold, his overcoat open, the smell of stale whiskey and cigarettes preceding him like a warning. Snow had melted into the shoulders of his coat. His piggy eyes moved over the assembled company and brightened at once at the sight of an audience. "What's all this?" he boomed. "Who told ye to gather them here?" Hamish did not even look round. "I did." Blair planted himself near the fire, puffed large with outrage. "This is my investigation, Macbeth." "Aye," said Hamish. "Try no to damage it." There was a gasp from one of the guests. Lugs opened both eyes. Sonsie's tail twitched once under the table. Blair turned toward Morag at once, smelling weakness as other men smelled rain.
"And what's that lass doing here? I thought she'd been told to keep out from underfoot."
Morag shrank visibly. Hamish's voice changed by a fraction. It went softer, the Highland sibilance sharpening under the calm. "She's here because she's been blamed enough." The room stilled. Blair glared. But Hamish had already gone on. "Miss Vane was no killed because she was rude, though she was that. She was killed because she found something worth money." He turned to Mr. Halberton Smythe. "You said she wanted the whiskey ledgers." "She did, and her notebook makes plain why." From his pocket he drew Marjorie's notebook. He had marked the page with a strip of hotel writing paper. He opened it and read without drama. Seal condition. Bottle count. Authenticity markers. He looked up. "There are also notes about premium stock, not matching what ought to have been there." Alasdair's face changed only slightly, but Hamish saw the mouth tighten. "One of the pleasures of a grand place," Hamish said, "is that guests like to be told they're getting something rare, something authentic. Tommel sold that idea with the whiskey. A heritage cask, special stock, official seal. But if a man had debts or a taste for easy money, he could make use of that." Blair snorted. "What in God's name are ye babbling about?" Hamish ignored him. He could draw off premium whiskey, replace it with cheaper stock, reseal the cask with the official stamp, sell the real bottles off books and hope no one cleverer than the guests looked too close. Mrs. Halberton Smythe gave a faint cry. Mr. Halberton Smythe stared at Alasdair as if seeing him for the first time. Alasdair said quickly, "That's absurd." "No," said Hamish. "It's tidy. Too tidy. Until Miss Vane arrived." He held up the notebook again. She noticed the seal flaw. She noticed the ledgers. And she noticed that the bottle counts and authenticity display didn't fit one another. She told somebody he was selling the hotel's soul by the bottle. The chef, listening from the doorway, gave a grim nod. Hamish turned to Alasdair. "You took her to the cellar to prove everything was in order. That was the bait. A quiet word beside the casks, away from the guests. Somewhere stone would swallow the sound." Alasdair's colour drained. "You'd already been using the stamp," Hamish said. "That's why there was fresh wax. You'd resealed a cask in haste to cover a missing bottle count. When she threatened to report you, and perhaps the hotel too, you struck her with the ledger board from the tasting room. No great mess, just one hard blow. Then you pushed her down the stairs and hoped it would pass for a fall. The room had become so still that the crackle of the fire sounded indecently loud. Blair barked. "Have ye proof, Macbeth?" "Aye." He turned, at last, and met Blair's little eyes. Fresh wax on the rail and stair, both bearing the same nicked impression as the Tommel seal. The stamp box moved and put back wrong, the brass cap knocked loose and carried off by Sonsie. He nodded toward the table, where the wildcat stared out with barbaric satisfaction, and the ledger board hidden behind the tasting cloths. "Wiped, but no well enough," a guest muttered. "Good Lord." Hamish looked back to Alasdair. "You got wax on Morag's apron because she'd been sent to polish the rail earlier. Handy, that. The blame would settle on a frightened lass instead of a smiling barman." Alasdair's mouth opened, then shut. Sweat stood on his forehead now, despite the cold room. "I was covering losses," he said at last. "Too fast. Only at first. The season was bad. The books were impossible. Nobody notices a little exchange in a place like this." Mr. Halberton Smythe made a sound like something breaking inward. Hamish said quietly, "Miss Vane noticed." Alasdair's eyes flickered toward the windows, then the door. measuring escape. But the guests were between him and one, and Blair, for all his faults, was large enough to block the other. "It was an accident," Alastair said. "She grabbed at me. She would have ruined everything. I only meant to frighten her." Hamish did not raise his voice. "You hit her, then you pushed her," Alasdair sagged. "That was enough?" Blair surged forward at once, scenting ownership. "Right! In the name of the law!" He seized Alasdair by the arm with theatrical force and nearly lost his footing on the carpet. The guests recoiled in delight and alarm. Lugs got up, offended by commotion. Sonsie vanished under the curtains like a thought withdrawing. As Blair roared for cuffs and witnesses and somebody from Inverness to record the lot, Hamish stepped back. The room had become a courtroom after all, but not because of Blair's noise. It had happened because one small flaw in a wax stamp had been given time to speak. Priscilla came quietly to his side. "You were right," she said. "I often am," said Hamish. She gave him a look cool enough to preserve fish. "Do not make a habit of saying so." Across the room Morag had begun to cry again, this time from relief. Mrs. Halberton Smythe went to her awkwardly, like a woman relearning how to be decent. Mr. Halberton Smythe sat down very suddenly and looked old. Outside, the snow still pressed at the windows. Inside, the truth had come out in a room full of teacups and frightened faces, which seemed to Hamish about right for Tommel Castle. Chapter 9. Snow melts, stories settle. The plough came through just after noon. It did not so much clear the road as bully it into usefulness. Dirty ridges of snow were shoved aside. The track down from Tommel Castle showed through in wet grey bands. Beyond it, the loch had lost its hard winter look and gone back to being water instead of metal. The sky was still low, but there was movement in it now, and a little drip had started from the hotel eaves. Hamish Macbeth stood in the entrance hall with his hands in his pockets and watched the first motor car edge down the drive like a cautious insect. Tommel Castle had survived. That, he thought, was more than could be said for its dignity. Alasdair Muir had been taken away before breakfast, with Blair making enough noise for 2 arrests and a public hanging. The guests had not seen the departure, which disappointed them deeply. They had therefore set about manufacturing a suitable version from fragments, glances, and nonsense. By 10 o'clock, a woman in a fur collar was telling another guest that the whisky fraud extended to half the Highlands. By 11, a retired solicitor had decided there must be London men behind it. By midday, the story had reached Patel's shop and come back improved. Hamish had no doubt Nessie and Jessie Curry would soon be giving it a moral frame. He did not mind that. Gossip, in Lochs, was rarely accurate but often useful. It had a way of pushing public opinion toward whatever the village most needed to believe. What the village needed now was something simple. Morag MacLean must be cleared. The hotel must be allowed to go on, and Blair must be given enough credit to stop him damaging the rest out of hunger. The first of these mattered most. Hamish found Morag in the breakfast room, helping strip the tables. The hotel had decided it could not function on nerves alone, and had therefore returned to napkins, toast racks, and pretending things had always been under control. Morag looked tired, but no longer hunted. "You shouldna be working already," Hamish said. She gave a shy half-smile. "Mrs. Halberton Smythe asked me back this morning." "Properly asked." "That's decent of her." Morag's mouth twitched. "It looked painful." "I dare say it was." He took off his cap and spoke, so the 2 chambermaids at the far side of the room could hear every word without seeming to listen. "You were no under suspicion, Morag. No by me. The wax on your apron was put there by accident, or design, after you'd been sent to polish the rail. That's all there is to say of it." The chambermaids bent lower over the cutlery, while listening with their whole backs. Morag swallowed. "Thank you, Constable." "Aye. And if anybody says different, tell them they may discuss it with me. That'll stop half the village. The other half will only improve it." This time she laughed outright. As he left the breakfast room, he met Mrs. Halberton Smythe in the corridor. She was carrying herself more quietly than before, as if the last 2 days had rubbed some of the finish off her. For once, Hamish thought, it improved her. "Constable Macbeth," she said, "I owe that girl an apology. I have given it." "That's good." She hesitated, then added, "And I owe you one as well." Hamish looked at her mildly. "I'm no keeping a ledger." "No," she said. "I see that." She drew a breath. "We were frightened. It is not a noble explanation, but it is the true one. Fear's common enough," said Hamish. "It's what folk do with it that causes bother." She nodded, as if she would remember that, though he doubted she would enjoy doing so. Mr. Halberton Smythe was in the office with the real ledgers spread out before him. He looked older and smaller than he had 2 days before, but also clearer in the face, as if a confusion had ended. "I suppose there will be letters," he said miserably. "There are always letters. And owners. There are worse things." He gave a weak smile. "Such as auditors. Such as pretending there's no trouble when there is." Mr. Halberton Smythe closed the ledger. "Do you think the hotel can recover?" Hamish looked round the office. The stacks of invoices, the tired furniture, the snowlight on the window, the smell of old paper and cold tea. Grand places, he thought, often survived by lowering their voices and carrying on. "Aye," he said, "but it'll need honesty, which is dearer than silver polish." Mr. Halberton Smythe laughed, despite himself. "My wife will hate that. She'll get over it." Priscilla found him later near the front steps, where Luggs was receiving tribute from departing guests as if he had personally solved the murder and arranged the road clearance. One woman bent to pat him and called him a splendid detective. Luggs accepted this with the solemn greed of a creature who considered admiration a form of catering. Priscilla glanced at the scene. "His vanity grows. He's earned it. He has done nothing. He's done it consistently." Priscilla looked out toward the drive. The snowbanks were grey now where wheels had cut through them. The wind had eased. Down below, Lochs sat under a thin wash of light and chimney smoke. "Blair is telling everyone he broke the case," she said. "That'll save time. You do not mind?" Hamish shrugged. "He likes credit the way Luggs likes sausages. It's easier to let him have a bit than be bitten over it." Priscilla turned to him then. "And the promotion threat?" Hamish's face altered only a little, but she saw it. "He mentioned it again," she said. "Aye, and he'll mention it till one of us dies." That made her smile, though only briefly. "You would hate Inverness." "I do already." She stood beside him for a moment in the cold hall light. Between them there was the old, unfinished ease and difficulty, never quite settled, never quite gone. "You were kind to them," she said at last. "More than they deserved. I was trying to stop the damage spreading." "That is the same thing." Before he could answer, Blair's voice came booming from the lounge. "Macbeth, get in here!" Hamish closed his eyes for a second. "There's gratitude for ye." Blair had assembled what remained of the guests for one final performance. He stood broad and flushed before the fire, his coat straining, cigarette in hand, speaking as if he had personally invented detection. "And once I saw the shape of it," he was saying, "the fellow had nowhere to go." The guests listened with polite greed. Blair saw Hamish and jabbed a finger at him. "Macbeth here can take down anything else needed for the report." Hamish nodded agreeably. "Aye, sir." Blair drew closer and lowered his voice enough for it only to reach half the room. "You're lucky I smoothed these things over," he muttered. "Another superintendent would have hauled ye off to Inverness by now." "Would he?" "Aye. Promotion may yet cure ye of loafing in villages." Hamish looked at him from under his brows. "I'd rather take the fever," Blair snorted, satisfied to have threatened something. It was enough for him that Hamish should imagine it. Then he turned back to his audience and enlarged upon his own brilliance until even the silver looked tired. Hamish slipped away while he was on his third version of the decisive moment. He drove down to Lochs before dusk. The village had already resumed itself. Smoke rose from cottages. At Patel's there were 3 women in the queue, and none of them buying quickly. Mrs. Wellington was on the church path, holding forth to 2 listeners who had the patient faces of people resigned to righteousness. Dr. Brodie's window showed lamplight. Angela, no doubt, was ruining something in the oven with cheerful determination. When Hamish stopped at the shop for tea and bread, the Curry sisters appeared, as if rung for. "We always said there was something wrong with that place," said Nessie. "Something wrong," echoed Jessie. "Though we didn't say whiskey." "I'll grant that," "We grant it," said Jessie. Mrs. Patel handed Hamish his parcel and said, "Morag's mother has already heard the girl is cleared." "That was quick," Mrs. Patel smiled. "Not so quick as it ought to have been." Nessie leaned in. "And is it true Blair solved the case?" Jessie leaned in too. "Solved the case?" Hamish considered this and then said, "It is true Blair has been saying so." Mrs. Patel turned away to hide a smile. By the time he reached the police station, the dark had come down properly. The stove was lit. The little room smelled of coal, damp wool, and home. Hamish set on the kettle, took off his coat, and sat for a minute while Luggs arranged himself by the fire with the heavy sigh of one who had suffered luxury and returned to simpler standards. A scratching came at the back door. Hamish opened it, and Sonsie came in without thanks, carrying all her wildness with her. He cut a bit of sausage from the heel he had brought back and put it down. She took it with grave professionalism and sat near the stove, yellow eyes half closed. "There you are," Hamish said. "Payment for services rendered." Luggs looked wounded at the idea of unequal distribution, and was given his own piece to preserve public order. Outside, water dripped from the eaves. The road was open again. Lochs had begun the quiet work of forgetting the parts it did not care to keep and remembering the parts it liked. Hamish poured the tea. He had not been promoted. The maid's name was cleared. The hotel would limp on, and the village, which had made a feast of the whole business, would soon return to its usual, less harmful wickedness. For the moment, that was enough. Tommel Castle will go on serving tea, polishing silver, and pretending old grandeur can cover fresh embarrassment. But the place will remember what happened there. So will Lochs. Small places have long memories, especially when pressure has shown people what they are willing to do to save face. That red wax cask seal looked like one more flourish of luxury. Just a mark. Just a promise. But the tiny flaw in it told the truth in the end. That is often how lies fail. Not in grand speeches, but in the small, careless detail that was meant to make them look convincing. There is a kind of cruelty in perfection when it is used to shame other people, and there is danger in desperation when men begin counting money more carefully than kindness. Trouble starts when reputation matters more than decency, and when people think a polished surface is the same thing as honesty. Still, the road opens. The kettle boils. A dog settles by the fire as if he has earned the peace of the whole Highlands, and a wildcat accepts sausage with the gravity of a judge. Comfort returns quietly in places like Lochs. It does not ask permission. It simply comes back. So tell me this, in the comments. When you decide whether to trust someone, what matters more to you? Their reputation, or the small detail they hoped nobody would notice? Thank you for spending part of your evening with me. If you enjoyed tonight's tale, do leave a comment and let me know where you were listening from. And if you fancy another Highland misadventure soon, there will always be something odd stirring in or around Lochs. Until next time, this is Oliver Finch, and this has been Highland Mystery.